Hey, folks. Thanks for joining. Thanks for being on time. I'm Andrew. I lead strategy at Knapsack. I'm also responsible for a lot of our customer experience, a lot of the implementation, the services, the stuff that goes from like, hey, I bought some software to hey, I've got a design system practice that's scaling and is successful. Now, I'm going to be moderating today, but our panelists are the real stars of the show. We've got Kelly and Nick from Bright Horizons, one of a team we've been talking to for a long time about some of the challenges that they've been trying to address, which spoiler alert, you're all probably trying to address similar things. And they're one of the newer teams to start using Knapsack, which we're really excited about. And then we've got Evan as well. Evan's, the brains behind a lot of Knapsack. It was his vision. He's built a lot of it. He's our CTO, head of product, and our co-founder. So excited to have this group here. The topic today is about, generally speaking, design to code, which is a wonderfully broad topic, right? And especially as we've innovated and the industry is where it is. Design to code for some folks means, how do I automate? How do I go right from design to code? At the same time, for 30 years, it's been a human problem, right? How do we go from an idea through a design process to the medium we're all now delivering in, which is code? And a lot of us still do it the way we did it when we were delivering in print, which was like, you got gloss and margin and paperweight and a couple other things. But the gap between the design process and the delivery medium was a lot smaller, right? And now we're in a place where it's kind of huge. It's kind of like an entirely different medium, a la like the rendering of the park that your town's building and then the real park with concrete. And like, we haven't really figured out as an industry how to close that gap. So, it's an exciting time in the space. There's a lot of ways teams are approaching that, from a human side, from a technical side. And so I guess I want to start with pretty broadly, maybe Kelly, we'll start with you, and then Evan, and then Nick. Say hello, introduce yourself, and I'd love to hear, like, just what is design to code? Like, what do you gravitate to when you hear that concept as a thing we want to talk about today?
Yeah, love it. And I can give quick context for anyone who doesn't know Bright Horizons. I'm Kelly Podorowski. I'm UX director at Bright Horizons, and we are a global provider of primarily childcare services, but also a huge suite of employee benefits. So Nick and I get to work on great problems. Like you were saying, Andrew, it's like, what's the problem to solve? So then when I think about design to code, we're designing solutions. As designers, we're spending a lot of time getting really nitty gritty. What's the order we ask the questions? How do people use it? And then how do we get it in their hands, right? So the code part is the next step, right? So anything I do needs to get coded. And I have to be honest, like, I think that's the least fun part, is talking through those little details. So having a plan that is more efficient, that people understand, so we have to talk less, is really exciting for me. So we're definitely always working to increase our efficiency in the design to code space there.
And as someone who has a child that's been at Bright Horizons and used all those apps, I appreciate your continued effort to make it an even better experience.
Yeah,
so thank you.
That's right.
Evan, what's design to code mean to you?
So, first, I think that one thing I think a lot is basically that it's not so much about like the source of truth is like either in design or in code, but I think the source of truth is really what end users experience. And so I think when people talk about design to code, kind of like Kelly mentioned, it's not about getting it to code, it's about getting it to users, right? And so like that's really kind of what it's about, because I think that what designers care about is they have this vision of an experience and they want users to have that experience. I think that they actually are pretty malleable on like, hey, can we adjust like this exact how it looks? But it's more about how it gets experienced. And so they gotta go through code to get there, and so I think that that's what everyone is kind of thinking about when they talk about like design to code, as opposed to like, can we actually like write some React from Figma or something like that? So yeah, it is kind of a people problem, a handoff challenge, right? And tools can help facilitate or hinder that. And it's about kind of just smoothing it all out, because really we haven't been as a a society making websites for very long. Like, you know, a lot of us were alive when people first opened up a web browser. And so, of course, our process isn't that great. Biology has been at this for a lot longer than us. So, of course, there's going to be a better way to do things, which I think, you know, speak for us all. And I'm excited to be in this industry because it's great because we're always finding like better ways to do things.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. You also you kind of highlight the fact that it's almost a disservice to present the conversation as design to code, because it kind of presumes that you have to do one before the other. Whereas like a lot of the industry and a lot of the tooling right now is focused on how do we do more design in code, in the medium of
Yeah.
definition, and not necessarily have to have a bridge, but only use the bridge when it's necessary. Which
Yeah. And I think a lot of engineers out there also like don't want to be gatekeepers or want to feel like it is, or to like, hey, I'm here to filter down your good idea to something that's just okay. Like they don't want to do that either. They're you know, Kelly, you talked about one thing that's unfun is going through the code and all the details. And so maybe that's not so much because it's code, but it's just because, hey, here's the scenarios that the experience will be experienced in, right? So I mean, it's like it's easy to basically be like, hey, here's this nice happy path, but what happens when there's this error state and it's loading and a bad network connection and like all those kind of things. And so I think that the designers still want to have a good experience there, but it's just about being like, okay, how do we handle these scenarios? And boy, there's a lot of scenarios.
yeah, and marrying the creative process to the practical realities of the delivery environment is a lot of, you know, what we'll get into today, and what are the different ways to do that. But before we go too far, Nick, as someone who I've always appreciated as a designer by trade, but with a real appreciation for all these things we're talking about, I'd love to hear, you know, tell us about your role and what comes to mind when you think about design to code.
Yeah, this is the perfect conversation because the final piece of translation to code is my favorite part of this career. So I'm Nick. I'm a product designer at Bright Horizons. Formally, I focus on experiences for our college advising service, College Coach, helping families get into college or get their children into college and to pay for college. But naturally, I also have a big interest in design systems and the intersection of design and code. I've worked in iOS development before I was a designer, making little apps for my friends and I. So yeah, I totally agree in that I don't think this is a discussion of design to code. I think that code is just another material that we have access to create new things in higher fidelity. I'm always inspired by design engineers like Emil Kowalski, who made this like incredible toast message component as part of ShadCN. And like all of these people who are designers who care about the form and the feel and function of things, but understand that in order to make that experience come to life, we need to use tools that are powerful enough to actually make that happen. So for me, I find that a lot of the time I'm opening up things like Cursor and VS Code as often as I'm opening up Figma, and grateful that I have things like Raycast to ask ChatGPT questions as I go.
I really love
Before
what
we
you
rabbit
said
hole-
there,
oh, yeah.
where I think I might misquote a little bit, but code is another medium that we can create with, that we can use to create with higher fidelity, or maybe another tool,
totally.
you know? And I really like that, the part higher fidelity, right? And so Kelly, you had kind of mentioned a little bit about like, oh, this part when we get into code, like the details. And I was talking, you know, it's like, well, maybe we kind of expose these other scenario. And so it's that higher fidelity, right, that basically can be expressed. Classic one, of course, animation, right? You can't do animation Figma too well. And so that can get expressed in this deeper medium, right? And so you know, it's right, how does it feel when it moves, like, for example. But like, yeah, it's that higher fidelity, because if you don't fill out those like details, then they're kind of just like left undecided, and so the user will still experience them. And so sometimes those scenarios or those states that haven't been kind of decided what should happen. Either like a developer somewhere will be like, well, something's got to happen and I got to ship this, and I'll just make a decision, or they'll make no decision and just like stuff happens, right? But at the end of the day, the user still experiences that. And so I think that high fidelity piece that you mentioned, I really like.
Totally. I think back to the rubber banding scroll in iOS, like when you get to the end of a list and you can pull and you can feel the tension pushing back. Like clearly somebody who understands physics worked on this.
Yep.
It's those things that I could never do in a static design tool or in my notebook, but I think that all of those things are equally important for the right context.
I don't know if they still have it, but the pull to refresh when you go to the top and then you tug down. I don't know if Yelp still has it, but it's my favorite one where you just pull it down and it's a rocket. And then as soon as you get it far enough, the rocket like launches. And I mean, like, that kind of delight and just like fun. Like I find myself like refreshing multiple times, just smiling.
I find there's a really interesting thing about digital design in that it's really different than pretty much every other design medium we work in. I gravitate to two examples, that highlight how most other media industry mediums, maybe to be, handle this. You either have those like I've in a prep session I was talking about like park design. I mentioned it earlier, right? Your town's designing a new park or a new condo building, and they have the fences up and they got the renderings, and then they build the thing. And nobody says, hey, that doesn't look like the rendering of the concrete. Yeah, because we all understand that this is a representation, right? This is intention, and the real delivery medium will be different and better, but like real. And so we operate with this innate understanding that the representation in design is not realistic to the delivery medium. Or I also think about things like lighting design. We've all been to concerts with amazing lighting displays. They have these visual ways that the lighting designer can orchestrate the whole thing, and it's pretty much a one-to-one translation to the experience the end users get, right? The timing and the array, and then I see it, and it looks like the thing I orchestrated. Digital doesn't do either of those, right? We make a thing, and we pretend that it's going to look just like the artifact coming out of design. And then later, 3 months later, the stakeholder's pissed that the fold is where it is, and I can't see the CTA, and sorry, trauma eliciting for all the audience. But we also don't do the latter yet, and I see a lot of attempts to get there where we design it, it's going to look like that, and we're not there either. So we're in this weird middle ground where we're trying to navigate a shift in culture, a shift in behavior, expectations, also technology and tooling. Like and I think we all feel this inflection point we're at. We're feeling the tension of that disconnect, but also opportunity as an industry. So I just throwing that out there as fodder.
Yeah.
For
Yeah, and I think the thing that's different there is, well, two things. One, we've been designing parks for a lot longer than we've been designing websites, so a little more experience. But also, like, it's interesting because it's not like we designed something in a digital realm and then suddenly like I printed it and it was like there and I touched it. I can literally pull up a Figma comp and the final website and put it up right next to it. And if I size everything right, they look exactly the same, and their differences only become apparent when I start to use it. Like I can't use Figma to sign up for an account and then start favoriting all of my movies and making like a list that I share to my friends, right? It's the experience of going through it and trying to like accomplish a goal, and like the friction you feel and the excitement you feel along the way and all of kind of those goals, that is starkly different. You can actually use a site, whereas you only can kind of like look at a comp.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Sorry.
This animation example, I feel like in our space, we have a lot of missed opportunities, right? Because some of the teams have somebody that knows physics that took the time to do this, and some of our teams do not. We have different dev teams, we have different timelines, and so they miss that opportunity. So somebody did something amazing that either doesn't get shared out because we never took the time to do that in the workflow, we never pushed it somewhere central, or the other thing that can happen is it makes other people's work look bad, because then people are like, where's the balance? Like what happened? So it looks like we're missing pieces, right? And so I want all of our teams to have that same delight. I said, but we're evolving our workflow to make sure we capture those highest fidelity points to really like level up our apps right now.
I think that's a great use case to highlight the organizational level challenge here, though, right? Because like if you're one team that's design engineering, just finite teams working on one product together, and you solve something that, like you described, that's ultimately solved at the final when you implement it, right? It's hard to get that right in Figma. We built it. We love the way it works. We love the way it feels. We'll, as a small team, reuse that next time we need that solution. But to get the organization and some other product team to utilize that, even for the exact same problem, they would have to be able to incorporate a design or a dev first, an implemented coded solution as part of the creative and design process, which just like culturally, behaviorally, the way our teams have evolved, that's a hard thing for a lot of, it's just not part of the rote way that we work. So it's a great example to highlight, like we've solved a thing. God, how do we scale benefiting from the fact that we've solved that thing?
Yeah. And even, animation can be seen as kind of lighter and fluffier, more of a delighter, but we also have things like accessibility, screen readers, right? So if we've got checkboxes that one team already went through remediation on, they figured out the right contrast levels, the animation, the colors, we want more teams to have access to that so they can still work fast with great quality, right? And limit our legal risk, increase the number of people who can use their work. So that becomes really important for us too. And it's the same thing, like the designer can get as far as showing color contrast. They can't do things like ARIA labels. They can't set up all the screen reader elements that a developer can do. That's another level of fidelity that the design team can't get to, but that we want to capture and reuse as much as possible, right? Without having to tell every developer about what to do.
And at the product level, like some of those things may not, ARIA tags probably don't affect the visual presentation. That is what the stakeholder approval, or at least some of the stakeholder approval is based on, right? And so it's entirely feasible and happens all the time that the same type of solution is spec'd out and approved. And even if the visual components were used the same, they get implemented differently. They don't have the same ARIA tags. And so again, this like, I don't want to say lack of appreciation for, but like we don't operate from idea to design to implementation in a way that respects and appreciates the value of what happens after design, essentially, right? That there's so much stuff there that if we can incorporate it better and find ways to incorporate it, and it's a hard thing, right? Because again, it comes down to cultural and behavioral change, which is by far the hardest part of this. Tools are there, right? The tools exist. How do you get a whole organization to operate differently? Like that's the tricky part.
Yeah, and I think that, so two things kind of occurred to me as you were talking about that, is that like, what happens when somebody not on like the design system team, someone who's implementing, has a good improvement that other people like want, right? And represents kind of like a new way of doing things. And I mean, maybe not like a radically new, it could be subtle, and to be able to share it. So there's, like two ways you can share it. You can talk to every single person and make sure every single day they use it and then do it the same. And then when you update it, you go back to every single person and then you tell them that, i.e. that is not sustainable, right? So then that's basically just like, hey, this is like in practice, or like using systems, right? And so like usually what you do is like you kind of got a big, tree, right? That kind of comes on down, and like you lift like shared solutions up, and then they become a little bit more generic and simple because they have to apply to like bigger areas. And you make sure that it's basically like the right way is the easy way, as in they're just you improved those checkboxes, and then it's in the core design system, and everybody just uses the checkboxes and they don't even know they're being excessively compliant. They're just like, hey, this is easier than having to make my own, right? And I mean, I think I'm saying stuff we all kind of know here, right? Like I think everybody here is like, yes, design systems are definitely the way. But yeah, just trying to, what I wanted to highlight there is that it was somebody not on the design system team that came up with something better. And so like getting those kind of improvements like back up into the design system is kind of like it's a facilitation process that's kind of necessary there. So I have a follow-up comment, but I just kind of want to pause there and seeing your reaction.
Nick has some things to
That,
say.
yes, that reminds me so much of the browser company's talk this year at Config, where they talked about leaving your fingerprints across the interface. That has, I have a little sticky note on my desk to consider fingerprints, because each designer across our company has things about their approach that are slightly different from mine that I really admire and that I want to adopt. And what I love about design systems as a whole is that, and why I'm confident about our system eventually getting full adoption, is that we can make something that's too good to be ignored, that respects all of those different fingerprints and becomes this like little collage of something that has a greater identity and has the imprint of each person. And hopefully that also inspires people to contribute more and to try to elevate their craft and work together. And yeah.
Really interesting. That brings my mind to something we've had a lot of conversations about recently, which is, you know, the idea of design systems, it is fundamentally about establishing constraints, right? If we need to solve these problems, we should have these parameters to work with, whether it's theming, collections, modes, etc., with your theming, or properties of your components. Like, hey, we think a reasonable amount of the stuff we need to solve repeatedly, we can solve in these conditions. And the design to code part of this is that in design, today, most of the time we present those conditions, but it's unfortunately really easy to break them. It's not unfortunate it's easy to break them. It's unfortunate that it's really hard to communicate what happens when you break them and the ripple effect, the butterfly effect. On the alternative, if we are able to work in the constraints as a baseline, you get to this point where you can't always ship everything. You probably ship your marketing landing pages just fine, right? You're half the pages I use to look at agendas and, you know, daily reports and stuff, that's fine. But when you go to look at, like, I need to build a new thing, it's actually really powerful to hit the constraints first and then define the scope of what you need to work on, versus say, you know what, this doesn't do what I need, I'll just fudge it a little bit. And then it turns out you've created chaos, versus de-scoping and clarifying the scope of what you need to work on. So that idea of, like, what are the parameters in which we're working in the context of design systems is one of those things where I think it's easy to miss the disconnects between design and code. Like, oh, I built it with components. I'm like, well, that one little shift created chaos. Versus if we can work with it. Yeah. Kelly, I see you excited to say something.
I fear and love when you say constraints, right? Because designers love to work within constraints, but there are negative connotations, right? So also, like, what if it's defaults, right? Because we fall into a place where often a designer is like, okay, do we have, you know, whatever, a progress bar default? And I just like that, where we're at, we're just missing the defaults right now, even, right? Because those are the things that speed us up and where we don't need to be unique, right? Like, nobody is going to say, I remember that progress bar that Bright Horizons had. That was sick. That really helped my kids, right? Nobody cares. Sometimes just having the default, we want it to be lovely, we want it to be consistent, but we just need a default sometimes, especially for our teams that want to move fast, or we're just testing ideas. And then when we have more needs, we can have additional options. Maybe not constraints, but it's like option A, option B, option C, as opposed to everybody reimagining that particular component. Like, that's not exact. We don't always have to spend all of our creative energy on the little things like that. We can find other opportunities.
And I see constraints not as a, like, fundamental limiter, but as a forcing function to create intentionality, right? And if all of us made every decision, every time we decided to, if you're a resource manager, like, when did I apply hours of design and engineering? It should be because we needed to, not because I had to make a page, right? Like, probably most of the page you could have made, but like, the idea of working within the constraints, it helps you identify what you should and need to work on, and you make those decisions with intention, right? Like, yeah, I would rather have it work this way. Is it worth the time and effort trade-off to get this thing and delay a week till? No, it's not. Cool, I'll go with the default, right? Yeah. So that's, but that, again, it takes an innate connection between, not just, you know, between design and code, to understand, like, what could we ship tomorrow and how do we work backwards from that and work on the delta, instead of just approaching each thing like, let's go make a page, see what we can do.
Yeah.
And I think
I've
there's so
also-
much as just, well,
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
go ahead.
Nick, go
Oh,
ahead.
thanks. I
As-
think there's so much that we can learn from engineering here. Like one thing that I sit back on often is our design system's more recent use of slot components, which is going to need some help to make sure that it aligns with our coded components eventually. But just the ability to publish a couple base layers of this is a card, but you can create an instance of a component and swap your content inside of it so that you can still use a base that you find valuable, but diverge in a way that still allows you to use our system to some degree is something that I'm really hopeful can reduce that volume of constraint.
Well, it totally is. And from what I've seen is, to be honest, operating that way is more of a cultural change than it is, tooling or technical. Like I've seen teams that we had a really early team that used Knapsack years and years ago that was one design manager who knew enough about code to define some values for color brand styles that would turn into CSS through it. And then he just spent all his time going to engineering teams and product teams and saying, what are you already building? Hey, can you use some on-brand CSS? And can you just capture this labeled progress bar? Because I think we're going to need that again. And then the next team used that. The point is they snowballed kind of organically what is in the system based on what are you building that can be reused? And then the important part that ties to what you're saying is everyone, they got to this point where they felt like everyone left things better than they found it, right? And this idea that like we're fully embracing the idea that we should reuse and iterate as a priority and make new things when we need to, or modify and iterate when we need to. And like, honestly, if you can embrace that as a culture and you can put infrastructure and tooling in place to support that, it kind of gets to this whole design to code thing where if we build a culture that's like, well, what can we do with what we have? All right, cool. And so a lot of those things are coded. Not all of them are. That's fine. But like, if that's the way you work as an organization around, we're going to work on what we've built and then make new things and then go the design to code workflow on those, you get really far really fast. And you may end up with they have a really weird design set. They like a 404 page and the labeled progress bar and like, but you know what? Those are the things they find themselves using the most. And they found a way to build a workflow that's based on what have we built? What's in code? How can I see it? What do we need to iterate? Do we need to iterate onward? And you get really far really fast with that.
So that's interesting because basically it's, right about, the piece about knowing what we have, right? What's kind of already there. I think that is kind of key to preventing people from, reinventing the wheel. I don't think anyone wants to remake, any components that already exist. They're just like, oh, that one's not good enough, I'm going to make my own. I think that they just are like, hey, this component doesn't exist, I'm going to go ahead and make it because we need it. And then later, that like it's basically found that it's like, oh, okay, actually that's a rework right there. So kind of, how can people be aware of what is made? And so Kelly, you were really talking about how people who have good ideas, getting them back up in the system. And so this a lot of times happens after things are already made. So the original component might be like made in Figma. Somebody starts to make it in code, and then boom, it's in the design system, people use it, everything's perfect. As in, like, you look at Figma and it looks like the component in production, right? And so but what ends up happening is somebody might say like, hey, can we adjust that drop shadow because it feels weird when we hover over it and during the animation. And they're like, it's a conversation between a designer and a developer, like God intended. Basically they interact and collaborate, right? That's what we always say everybody should do, is just like, hey, collaborate and work together. And so a lot of times the code can get updated, but people don't, backport it to Figma, because why do that? Because basically, it's not like users experience it. Figma served its purpose, and like, let's go ahead and like, just get it to the users. Great, cool. Now on to the next thing. But then somebody goes to like, consult Figma and they see that basically that button is like out of date, right? But they don't know that. Or maybe like a component got made in the design system, but it never even got made in Figma because, hey, there was enough pieces there or something like that. And so like it contributes to the problem where people don't know what exists, you know? And so it's kind of this idea of like, before you start throwing things over the fence, you should know what's on the other side of the fence, right? Kind of knowing what's already there, because instead of reinventing it, you might be able to make it better or something like that. And so I think that it's, my point is kind of really two things is like, you know, one, making sure that everybody kind of knows what is available, right? And then two is like, what's that process for, like, you have like approximations and summarizations of what's available. Like a comp is a summarization of what's available in the design system. And how do you kind of keep those up to date? Or if at the very least be like, hey, you know, this, you know, moved from design to code a year ago, please go see that, or something kind of like that. So that way people aren't working on like, you know, old, you know, basically how things were working, you know, a year ago, and then try to build on top of that, because then it's building on top of shaky ground.
Well, and core to that is the innate appreciation that what we're doing is linked, right? It's, you can't do, well, you could do one without the other, and that one's engineering. And I don't think anyone here wants them to just do engineering without some design input, right? But you certainly can't do design and hope to affect your users without the engineering. So the more that we can, you know, relate those two, the better. I'm going to get some of the questions that are piling in, but I want to shift gears just a little bit, because I think it wouldn't surprise me if some folks who showed up to a webinar that's more or less about design to code are thinking about, how have we solved it with robots, right? How has Skynet made it so the thing in Figma shows up to our users? And I, particularly in some of our prep sessions, Nick, I thought you had some really interesting comments that kind of got it, like, as a designer who understands the importance and, you know, realities of the medium we're working towards, how you've started to use some of those AI tools like V0, for example, not to necessarily say I made the thing to ship, but to aid, to solve the human problem of how to design to communicate more effectively with engineering. So I'd love for you to just share a little bit about how you sort of started to incorporate some of those tools into still essentially a design workflow that is ultimately going to feed into an engineering workflow downstream.
Yeah, totally. This is one of my favorite spaces. I love these tools. They give me so much inspiration. And
so they've solved all your problems,
my
is what you're saying.
I wish one day. And if you have one, well, let's connect. I want to know about it. But anyway, I think of my contributions in code as like the equivalent of a musician making a reference track for one of their friends. Like I'm just trying to articulate an idea in a way that's fundamentally the same as my trying to articulate an idea using something like Figma or my notebook. With a bit of a background in React and Tailwind, sometimes that starts with just an open code editor and creating a new React project and writing something that's in my mind. However, with being on the V0 beta back in the day, had so much fun jumping so much faster using text prompts, like, and seeing all of the things that were already made and being able to iterate on it with my words rather than by going line by line and trying to make edits.
Yes, it's this idea that English is the new coding language.
Totally, yeah. And the only place that I really want help in this space is to make it more real. I can still see the uncanny valley between using Shadcn with V0 and our Angular material coded components. And what I really hope to see at some point is the ability to integrate my own design system and start generating more real code.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where all this is headed for sure. Yeah. You know, and I think that is basically it, you know. So we've got basically these kind of great tools out there that can use, you know, common UI patterns, right? And so, I mean, everybody, you know, wants basically like it to be like, you know, on brand for them, right? That's why we have design systems. And so I think that, you know, the best way to get ready for you know, this revolution is with design systems there, because basically AI works really, really well with constraints, right? And so that is basically like, what we're doing. We're basically like, hey, locking down the colors with design tokens, locking down like the spacing with design tokens, and like, a button size prop of small, medium, large that uses design tokens, right? And so I think that is, what you kind of need to do, because really, like, as we've transitioned from like print design to like, fixed web design, at first there was a lot of like, hey, this all can get controlled. And like the first kind of big disruptor for like, hey, designers, you can't control what people experience, was really like, responsive web design. Like suddenly like people could resize the browser, and it was like, I think we all had to learn to like let go a little bit, but also making some constraints. It's, because you can't control what it's going to look like at every single width, but you can basically put some rules in play that turns out that actually you get a wider like amount of experiences than you ever kind of thought. And I think that personalization has taken this even like a step further, because then suddenly like, you're looking at a web page at a certain width, but then suddenly the content can change depending on who is there. And so there is yet another piece of like having to like let go a little bit, but putting in a little bit of rules, so that way you get like this wider experience, like, range of experiences for your end users. And then AI is going to come along a little bit more and basically be like, okay, like those, those experiences can actually be different. Not only the content, not only the layout based on this on the web page size, but basically like the components used are even going to be like, not what you can expect there. And so like, I think that there's basically like, it's challenging for us all to kind of be like, wow, that's a lot of control to let go. And so I think that basically brings in two things, is like, what's essential, right? Is just basically focusing on like, hey, what are those important parts, and what are kind of those like, like rules that you can kind of put up to basically get like this very wide range of experiences for our end user, and then be pretty happy with what those end users are experiencing, because that's what we kind of all want at the end of the day, right? Is a good experience for the users.
I want to use that as a segue a little bit to one of the questions we have. You brought up constraints again, and there was a question in here around how specifically one of the attendees, senior leadership, is looking to the design system to essentially find a way to use AI to accelerate the design to dev process, right? And the question is around how much demand is there for that? Their systems are doing this, but this is something we focus on a lot as a product company, not just in terms of what we do today, but what's the opportunity for teams in the next couple of years. And, per the idea of constraints, design systems represent the constraints of, as we said earlier, what if you can work within these, we can solve business cases that we meet repeatedly really fast. What we are not good at as an industry is tying that into all the ways we create these experiences, right? So you have your components. We work with like pharmaceutical companies who make 300 websites a year, and 80 to 90% of them are the same. And so like in that case, you should be able to make most of what you want within the constraints of the design system, but like operating that way that really recognizes the benefit of, if 80% of your sites are the same, you should move 70, 80% faster probably, but that's really hard for teams to do. We also think though that represents the opportunity for AI, right? The constraints, AI loves constraints and it loves structured data, right? And so if we can represent things like components and templates and a hierarchy of nested elements, UI elements, and those have properties, which you can almost visualize the homepage of any of your websites that are on this call as a bulleted list, right? And so the closer we can get to operating in this world where we work within constraints we have, ship things that fit with the constraints fast, and then abstract out and realize where we need to work on defining new constraints or breaking the constraints. I really feel like that's the future of digital production in terms of like dramatic efficiencies, utilization of the AI tools that are forming. But I don't know, you two are in a product org. Like we sit here and we try and push the industry and talk to teams and bleeding edge, blah, blah. How much of that's realistic, right? Like how close are we to using AI to actually deliver stuff in your mind?
I think so. We're at a place where we're experimenting. So our developers got excited about Builder.io as a way to generate code fast. But my concern is that we're so immature with our design system. They're going to be making a lot of random stuff really fast. And we're not gonna get the results we maybe want. But I think it's a great opportunity. So I said, I love the way you're thinking, but we need those rules first, right? So let's get everything documented in a place we can access it. Let's get the rules in place, and then you can generate fast, because it gets back to that like higher fidelity interpretation, right? We have to have a way to consistently interpret like the different states, the different accessibility issues. So I'm a little bit nervous that a AI tool is just going to generate stuff that has so much cleanup that it's not going to save a whole lot of time.
It
Especially
all
for
sounds
starting
powerful, but it shines a
Okay.
light on the gap we're talking about, right? Which is
Yeah.
design is responsible for defining a lot of the conditions and the experience, and hopefully doing some user research. What do we need to solve for, the business cases, the problem solving, per Evan's comment about logistics and like details earlier. Like there's a lot of we've all seen the back and forth of like, hey, I need you to design this error state that you didn't account for. Like, so there's all that, but all of that, once we solve, we could systematize, operationalize. But again, that goes back to like, we would need a way to work across design and code from start to finish that incorporated all of those things, right? The scenario identification from design, the ones from engineering that design didn't think of, the fact that we've solved these things, and it's tricky, right? But theoretically, I mean, design systems have always been in this interesting space, right? We're conceptually dead simple. Reuse stuff and only make when you need to. Sweet, easy. Operationalize that across hundreds and thousands of people, hard as hell, right? But same thing here. We're like, oh, we'll just, if we can feed the decisions we've made to AI, and then it can build most of it. It seems really simple, and a lot of us are working on tools to do that kind of thing. But it, you know, it's as with most of these things, the human challenge just gets in the way. Because even if you have the best tools, you still got to get people who are used to like pitching a stakeholder who approved a PDF and then he was used to seeing. You got to get through all that change as well. So always easier said than done. I want to. Evan said that he's going to answer this question live based on what Zoom's interface tells me. So I'm going to go ahead and read the question and let Evan answer it. Anonymous attendee asked, when it comes to upskilling, what are some steps designers can make now to set themselves up for success later on? Evan.
So, Nick, I'd like for you to kind of, follow up
Evan
after
claimed
my
the answer to defer to Nick.
Please.
I like that. That's a baller
yes,
move.
I don't know what the answer is. I know who might have it. No, so kind of a two-parter. I want to let me take the first stab at it, but Nick, I'd love for you to kind of follow up like afterwards. So, I like the old cliche, like designers should learn how to code, right? It's like, oh gosh, like that part again. But like, I think that like that's actually the area where like AI can like really help out. Because being able to, hey, open up VS Code, have one of your developer buddies get you going, make sure that everything builds right, and then, AI is there for the unfun parts of code, because like I think a lot of people are like, okay, open the angle bracket, let's start. I kind of got this, and then things go wrong. And that's when coding gets frustrating. And I think that's like one area where AI really shines is like, hey, AI, what's wrong with my code? And they're gonna be like, well, on line 32, there's forgot to do a closing quote. You're like, oh, okay, great. It's just like, that's all it takes to break the internet is a missing closing quote, but using AI to basically get into some of that like prototyping in code, right, is really powerful. And so like, it's not saying like, hey, you have to make everything that way, but like knowing what it can do, it kind of gets back to that other thing about basically like, hey, what does the system even have? What are the current capabilities? Let me kind of play with like these different props. And I think like as AI gets better and better, I mean, like it's already good enough to basically be like, hey, what's wrong with my code? Why is it not breaking? But it's getting even better and better to be like, make a grid of 3 cards using the components that are like locally, right? And so like that kind of stuff can really help like speed up a lot of things. And so I think that, that would really help on upskilling. And so maybe that, the code you write doesn't become the new homepage, but your knowledge of like kind of like how code works made you a better designer. Your knowledge of what the design system has and does not have is going to help those conversations you have on be like, hey, what should we make next? So those would be some of the things I would kind of mention is what would help out. Nick, would love kind of some of your thoughts on that as well.
Oh, you just crushed that answer. And I feel like I'm going to largely reiterate things that you just said. I mean, I've personally found that the only way for me to really upskill is to build something that I wanted to with the garage door open and ask for a lot of help and share what I'm working on with a lot of people. Um, because I find that I have a connection to it in a way that I won't if I'm just going through another tutorial. To talk about AI, I think one thing that at least I'm observing in my own practice is that I find that it's far nicer to have like a pair programmer in AI than it is to just like ask for a bunch of generated stuff and then try to reverse engineer my understanding of it. So I find, and this was advice from Gavin Nelson on Dive, I think you should totally listen to that to learn more about this. But his advice is to ask ChatGPT or whatever model to explain a concept and then to try writing and implementing that concept and then ask it to give feedback and then ask why a bunch of times to actually learn something out of it. And that's been the thing that I've found most helpful. But yeah, make stuff. It'll feel natural eventually.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you just got to start, right? So one thing I just want to chime in there is that you mentioned pair programmer. And so like there's definitely like we've given talks on this where there's like the different kinds of AIs, like, you know, and you basically have like that kind of like librarian where you like this is the kind of the standard chat GPT, like just like asking it questions, you know, where like whereas basically like, you know, GitHub Copilot, like in VS Code or like Cursor, which is kind of like VS Code, but has got some of those things as well. Which, by the way, if you're a designer coding, 100% make sure you're paying for GitHub Copilot or something. It's like $10 a month, but something like that is, you know, it's transformative. But anyway, it's, you know, we're not in there basically being like, hey AI, you know, please make like 3 buttons here. What happens is like it basically is guessing what you're kind of going to type next, and then it's kind of like half opacity like afterwards, and then you just either you hit tab and then it happens. And so it's kind of like, you know, the pair programmer being like, hey, it looks like you're probably going to do that. And I mean, boy, like especially once you already have gotten right like a little bit and then you go to like write more. I mean, a lot of times I'm like enter tab, enter tab, enter tab. I'm a coder. Once it's kind of rolling and everything like that. So yeah, that pair programming piece where like it's kind of like, hey, suggesting for like auto completion of code, that is like really helpful. More, well, not more, but it's just different than like asking chat GPT and having conversation back and forth. The explain the concept piece, that's definitely like a great spot for like that conversational back and forth aspect.
Totally. And I don't think there's any better tool for that, just in practice than Raycast, hitting command space and typing out my question and not losing a context shift. Fantastic.
Raycast is fabulous for basically just like those very quick ones. I use that and love that as well. So maybe in some of the show notes when we kind of send them out, maybe we could send some links to basically like a code editor and like AI companions that are suggested. We can send those out in the notes afterwards.
And if you're not familiar with Raycast, Copilot, any of these, check them out. But we'll send some follow-up links. I want to call attention to, with the time we have left, one of the questions in here around how does this impact developers? If they're quote unquote replaced by AI, could they be converted to designers? My take on all this is that we're still in the business of moving design closer to development, right? And that nothing's going to users without development. And so there's a lot of effort going into making design tools, you know, handle things in the way that they may show. Figma's done a lot of work to make sure components have properties and variants. Variables, collections, and modes generally map to CSS variables for web delivery. But like, it's a representational medium, right? We're still working in a thing that ultimately needs to show up in an entirely different medium vis-a-vis the new city park example. So I don't view this as about replacing developers. I view this as like, how do we, in many ways, make their life a lot easier by taking expectations from being based on a PDF coming out of a picture-based tool to getting expectations to be more based in the reality of the medium of delivery. right? And it's designed to code because code is the thing we're all moving to. And so I certainly hope that we're not replaced. Frankly, I think it's more likely that design teams get scaled down than engineering teams, although it's probably a bit of both, to be honest. But we're more operating on minimizing the disconnect and the inefficiency in the middle than we are saying this team or this team needs to scale down. But I don't know, Kelly, you're in the most sort of strategic operational role as someone in a product org here. How do you think about like the potential of all these exciting things we're talking about? What does that mean from like a team and staffing model? Like who's gonna, is someone, are we letting go the engineering team?
My first thought was if that was written by a front-end specialist, I want them to apply to Bright Horizons immediately. My second
Please.
I like that plug. That's nice. Way to use the venue.
Because
we got our plugs. You can have your plugs.
Yeah, sure. I think because what we're talking about is really replacing a lot of that like front end work, right? At least at this point. And where my team is concerned, that's the work that we really are needing the most help with. Because we have so many developers who are full stack. And so this is just one piece of the puzzle. So this would let them do front end faster and leave them time to do some of the other back end pieces. But roles might shift, but I don't see roles going away particularly.
Nick, I'm just like, what part of this is about, reducing resources downstream versus improving your ability to communicate effectively with those resources downstream?
I'm yet to see a great example of where I would be outright replaced in my role, and like where my front end companions would get replaced. I think of it like a really powerful intern that is helping me do a bunch of work that I don't want to do to instead focus on places where I can actually have a strategic impact, and try to make people's lives better. I wish I could had a crystal ball to figure out how to shake that out.
For our design team, I would love our shift, the amount of time we spend on annotation to go down, the amount of time we spend on usability testing, idea validation, user research to go up. Because we do have a team of generalists, so we have a lot of skills. Like I said, a lot of areas where our designers can roam and spend their time, but we spend far too much time annotating interactions right now. This
just to bring it back full circle to the start, I said this is a broad topic, right? Design to code can be automation, AI, or it can be and is always a human process. I think one of the things we come back to a lot with teams we work with, whether they use knapsack or not, is embracing the fact that design in the world of digital is about intent more than about exact expression, right? And like, if we can embrace that, and this goes back to like the rendering of the park, the intent is there's going to be a wall of concrete. It's going to look different when it's in real concrete versus a 3D render, a CAD model, right? And that when you appreciate that, you can work so much faster and communicate better. And that like, yeah, we have to have a lot of back and forth. We need tools, we need media to have that back and forth around, oh, you want this. I can do this. I could do this, but it's going to add 2 weeks. I can do this tomorrow, right? And the more that we can just base the creative process, I don't even say creative, like the product management process in this really clear understanding of what can we do today? What would it take to do a thing we'd rather do? And let's operate in that delta. We just don't do that, right? We operate in design to code in the worst way, in that we design everything and then we say, let's build it. And hopefully the components we used in design map to components in code. And hopefully the components they map to look something like and function something like the components here. But I'm constantly reminded that we're really early on in this stuff as like a species of humans making things in a media, right? Evan said earlier, we've been making stuff. There's other things we've been making for hundreds of years, right? Some train control panels we've been making for 150, 180 years. We've been making screen-based UIs for like 30 years, maybe. Before that, it was just engineers building them, so they didn't look good. But
first time a browser was used to view a web page on the internet, it was December 1990.
Correct. So we generally, as
wouldn't
a species,
be born for 6 more years.
Still kind of suck at this. And so the more we can, embrace, be aware of the challenges we face, getting things from not in design, idea, spec, design, QA, et cetera, code, delivery. We've got a long way to go. But anyway, we're running out of time. This was really great. First and foremost, Nick, Kelly, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. It's so great to have people who not just sling tools that are helping teams with this stuff, but people living it every day, as you do what you do to make a living. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective. And Evan, always great to have you and your thoughts as someone who's trying to help shape the future of this industry. So thank you all, and thank you for everyone.
Always love good conversations and talking shop. Thanks everybody for sharing your thoughts and taking time to listen to us all ramble.
And if you were too shy or didn't get a chance, whatever it was, hello@knapsack.cloud. You got a chance to get in touch with us. LinkedIn, I know you probably can't avoid us. You probably get pestered with us in emails all the time. So please reach out. We want to hear from you. We love talking to people thinking about this stuff. Hell, you can be on a future webinar if you chirp at us enough. So appreciate everyone. Thank you again to our panelists, and look forward to seeing you all out there.
All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much,
Take care, everyone.